So we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate Puerto Rican Chicago, Schooling the City, 1940 to 1977. My name is Heather, and I'm the Publicity Manager at the University of Illinois Press. And I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Velázquez and Dr. San Miguel for being here today. They're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for a 15-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use promo code MV22 to get a 40% discount on the book on the University of Illinois Press website. I'll put the promo code and a link to the book in the chat box. We will also be recording the event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both the discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our guests. Dr. Velázquez is an Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies and the Rainbolt Family Endowed Education Presidential Professor at the University of Oklahoma. As a historian of education, her work centers race, gender, and sexuality and the history of urban education. Her book, Puerto Rican Chicago, Schooling the City, chronicles the Puerto Rican community's response to the urban decay in which they were forced to live, work, and especially learn. Her work has most recently appeared in the journals Latino Studies, Centro, and Gender and Education. Dr. Velázquez is currently working on a second book project that historicizes Puerto Rican women and other Latina activists in higher education across the Midwest, from the 1970s to the 1990s as they worked to create home spaces. Dr. San Miguel Jr. is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Houston, Texas, and an activist parent in the community. He is a renowned scholar in the history of Mexican-American, Chicano, and Latino education, and has written on educational struggles in the community and on language, politics, and education. He has published extensively and is best known for the following books: Chicano Struggles for Education, Contested Policy, The Rise and Fall of Federal Bilingual Education, Brown Not White, School Integration and the Chicano Movement, and Let All of Them Take Heed, Mexican Americans and the Quest for Educational Equality. San Miguel is also a cultural historian and an avid social dancer. He has published articles on the history of Música Tejana and is the author of the groundbreaking book titled Tejano Proud, Tex-Mex Music in the 20th Century. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to our guests. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Velázquez for inviting me to be a part of this very important event. And thanks to the press for organizing this virtual event. Dr. Velázquez, I'm so excited about your book, focusing on race, politics, and education, Puerto Ricans in Chicago. This book looks at the crucial role activism plays in Latinx education in a large urban area, but it breaks new ground in several different ways. It is the first major publication that focuses on the historical experiences of Puerto Ricans in the schools of the Midwest. This book thus moves beyond the Black-white binary in the history of education, beyond Mexican Americans in educational history, and beyond developments in the Southwest. Can you tell me a little bit more about this book and how you initially came across this topic?
Well, of course, I want to start off by saying thank you to the press and Heather for creating this space for us to be in conversation, but especially thank you to Professor San Miguel because for several reasons, right? Setting the foundation for so much of the work that many of us are engaging in history of education, but then also in Latino history. But I remember in ARA 2010, you walked into my presentation and asked one question. I can't tell you what the question was, but from that moment forward, every time I looked in the audience on any panel that we were presenting on Latino education, you were always there. And to me, that was always meaningful, but it also came with a responsibility, right? So, asking about how this book came along comes from being part of two different genealogies, right? One is the field, right, which of course your work is very foundational in, but then also thinking back about what it meant for me to be part of this larger conversation as someone that experienced a lot of this history. And I think about, it's a small piece of the book, a small little passage of the book where I make a comment about how that same 14-year-old Puerto Rican kid that was looking down from his second floor apartment in 1966 and looking at what was happening on Division Street when the uprising was happening, then becomes this 20-year-old first generation college student a few years later, right, fighting for his own place at Northeastern. And that passage reminds me that there's a genealogy or nexus of our schooling experiences as Puerto Ricans and as Latina, Latino, Latinx, right? And I think about how when I walked into my own kindergarten classroom in Humboldt Park and had to deal with the mispronunciation of my name, because what kind of name is Mirelsie, right? Especially for the teachers that were forced to learn how to pronounce my name or chose not to. But then also the misunderstanding or disinterest in my needs as a new migrant to the city when I moved to Chicago. And I inherited a lot of the consequences of these long-standing struggles that I documented in the book, right? And the struggles that the community had endured. But where the shift happened for me as a student, as a Puerto Rican kid in Chicago schools, was when I entered the classroom of Ms. Navarro, who was a Puerto Rican educator, invested not only in our learning, right, but our sobrevivencia, in our survival within that space. And I was reminded recently when I did an oral history of Ms. Navarro, because we reconnected years later, and she shared her own history as a teacher. And she had to remind me that what I was experiencing in the classroom, right, was what she had to experience as a Puerto Rican teacher in the city, one that she inherited because she came from the island to teach, kids in Chicago schools. And she told me, right, that if this is the way that they treat me, a teacher, someone with a college degree, right, just because I'm Puerto Rican, imagine how they're treating you all in these classroom spaces. And so she had to remind me that we have to invest or reinvest in our own communities, right, because we're part of these histories. And I carry that with me. So this book, again, to that question of where this book started, it really started when I walked into that classroom many years ago. And I entered graduate school. I was reminded of how little had been written of our history. And I tell my own students, I started graduate school thinking that I was going to talk about policies affecting Puerto Rican students in contemporary times. And my advisor sat me down and said, okay, you got to start with history. And he was not a historian, but reminded me, you have to start with history. So I started with history. And I stayed there. And it's been, probably 18 years at this point when I started writing that history and started thinking about that history. And it was a good reminder that we can't serve our students today in these spaces if we don't understand our communities and understand that history. So to me, this is really where the book came from, is understanding my sense of responsibility to the history that I came from, right? But filling in the gaps in the larger historiography in our communities, because there's a lot more work that still needs to be done.
I noticed that in reading the book that you use several important concepts. And I was wondering if a lot of that is in the title itself of the book. And so I was hoping maybe you could just address the title of the book itself and how this is different from other books on Puerto Ricans in Chicago.
I love the title, right? But it was not the first choice. And I think it's a good reminder for folks that this is what happens when you're lucky to work with good acquisitions editors and series editors who sometimes know a little more about what you're trying to do with the book, right? And so it became a question about what the title was going to become, because the first one was kindly vetoed for different reasons. And so I think about that question that comes up across the book, right? This theme of who's schooling whom, right? Because we like to think that it's schools and educational systems that are doing the schooling. But I think that, one of the conversations I'm having, or the major conversation I'm having with the book, is that really it was community schooling the city, right? And that shifts depending on what moment we're living in, right? What decade, we're in conversation, right? And the title also builds on other books, right? Part of my hesitation at first from calling it Puerto Rican Chicago is because, to me, one of the most foundational books on Chicago is Felix Padilla's 1987 book called Puerto Rican Chicago, right? And so I had to kind of sit with this idea of what it meant to kind of borrow from someone else's work. But I also think that for those of us who are writing about our own communities' histories, we want people to kind of build on our work, right? But then I also think about Lilia Fernandez's Brown in the Windy City, right? Who pushes us a little further and being intentional of how she positions Puerto Rican history in a city that really reminds us of the consequences of not just these government policies on a structural level, but its consequences in the lives of people, right? Centering their stories as this integral part of telling the history of Chicago. And what I hope that my book adds to this, right? Puerto Rican Chicago is really engaged in this deeper genealogy or understanding of what comes next, right? If the history of migration and community building is the beginning, right, which a lot of what these historical texts and sociological texts are talking about in Chicago, right? If that's the beginning, then how do we see the community's relationship to schools and schooling as a bridge to move us forward, right? And how do schools tell us how the community really experienced the racial politics of the era? But then more so, how do we connect this story to the overall status of the archipelago and coloniality, right? To me, that's what schooling the city means. It's reminding the city that these communities have had to contend with these racial politics for decades, right? And these decisions that are being made to them. But now it's time for the city to kind of listen and learn from what the community had to offer.
Well, since you bring up the issue of coloniality, I noticed that in the one of the chapters, you elaborate on how coloniality shapes your argument, and more specifically, how colonialism shapes the history of Puerto Ricans on the island and in the mainland. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship?
So I'm glad that you remind me of this, right? Because it kind of, not that it gets lost in the book, but I think it's the thread that holds the book together, right? And one of the main arguments I really want folks to kind of understand is that although the approaches to schooling for populations such as African Americans and indigenous communities were similar at times, right, and more violent, if you understand the history of schooling for Black and indigenous populations, there's something really unique to Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans' relationship to schooling because of those colonial ties, right? And I discussed that earlier in the books, that soon after U.S. occupation in 1898, the U.S. aligned its military approach to creating cultural and political and social shift across the archipelago to the teaching of its children, right? What the military was doing and what the politicians were envisioning for the island was then being transferred and translated into how they were going to approach schooling of children, right? And so then education and schooling for Puerto Ricans, across the island really became infused with everyday reminders of these evolving and imposing colonial relationships, right? Students were expected to embody American patriotism. They were taught how to march in schools and learn, patriotic songs. Some argued that, the average elementary school child, school-age child in Puerto Rico knew more about American history than those in the continental US, right? So this is what their reality was, right? And teachers were similarly, or at least Puerto Rican teachers were similarly facing some of those same pressures, right? How to best facilitate this shift in conversation, right? And so teachers were being told that if they did not help facilitate this change on the island, that they were failing in some way. And there's a history, and folks have been documenting most recently, how Puerto Rican teachers on the island were resisting these changes really early on, right? Because they were resisting it. And in every aspect of their lives, residents were also reminded that they were becoming unwilling subjects in U.S. social, political, health, economic, and educational experiments, right? What was happening on the island was almost a testing ground for what the U.S. was going to be doing across the United States, all with little or no say, right? So these things are happening to them, especially around education, with Puerto Ricans not really having say of what's happening to them. And schools are a reminder of this, right? So by the time the population came to the United States, or started to migrate to the US, across US cities, and the diaspora grew, they had already experienced American education, right? And understood its limitations and its failures. And it was a struggle that they picked up in schools and community activists in New York, Chicago, and other communities. So to me, that's really one of the places where it differs, right? They experience, and Sonia Nieto tells us that, right? That Puerto Rican children have been in US schools since 1898. Not necessarily when they come and migrate to continental US cities, but this begins in 1898, right? And they don't separate their reality as students and residents from the reality of that continued colonial status of the island, and demanding agency and getting a say in what was going to happen to their schools and to their communities, or framing their schooling was evident of that, right? Where coloniality is always part of that conversation, right? That this idea of how do we have a say and control what's happening to our community, right, around schools, because that's the conversation that they're still having across the archipelago.
Yeah, you know, one of the important aspects of this book is how you then go about describing the manner in which the community responded to the conditions they faced in Chicago, particularly in the schools. Now, there's a lot of issues, and we'll discuss several of them, but I was also impressed with the emphasis that you gave on the role that women played in these community and school-based forms of activism. Can you talk a little bit about that and some of the women that played these key roles and contributed significantly to advancing the struggles there?
Yeah, you know, and it starts really early, right? And one of the things that I appreciate from some of the other works that have been done about Puerto Ricans in Chicago by Merida Rua, you know, and Lilia Fernandez, and others, is that women have always been, you know, part of those stories, right? And again, it begins really, really early. So what we see in the 1940s, we see these two different types of gendered migrations happening to Chicago. One of them is laborers, right? You know, these mujeres were being brought to Chicago, and I talk about it in the book, to serve as, you know, well, to serve the city, right, as laborers. And then we also have an intellectual migration happening too, meaning that as, you know, island politics is shifting, right, there's a need to encourage migration for educational purposes, right? So we see a group or a cohort of women who come to the University of Chicago primarily to study, right? And the idea was that they were going to come, you know, to Chicago to do that work and then come back to Puerto Rico and kind of influence the building of the University of Puerto Rico, right? So the idea was that they were going to come back. But what happens when these, you know, island women, right, and these trabajadoras, these women who are working in the city, cross paths, right, because they start interacting in these social spaces within the city, is that they come to realize that there's a, you know, almost a cultural or social capital that the college students have that can help the women in Chicago who are there working have their needs met, right? And so we see the beginnings of, although, you know, I primarily talk about school-based and community activism, to me, that's the beginning of activism, school-based activism, because you have these women who are using the capital that their role as students at the University of Chicago give them to start and enact change within the community, right? And so then that becomes part of the beginning of that genealogy. And I use the language of genealogy a lot because I like to think within our communities, especially, we're looking to the past to think about what we can offer the future, right? And we're all in community with one another. And so those early mujeres that start those conversations about how to create change or enact change within the city, then influence the ways that other women who come in the 1960s and 1970s start thinking about their responsibility to the community, right? And so in the book, I focus on the lives of three women in particular, right? One of them is Milta Ramirez, who becomes the founder of Aspira of Illinois, right? And I tell the story of how Milta gets on a Greyhound bus, as herself a college student and a young mother, gets on a Greyhound bus and goes all the way to New York to convince Antonia Pantoja to let her open up a chapter of Aspira in Chicago, right? And, you know, and Antonia tells her no a couple of times before she says yes, right? And, you know, and Aspira is very influential. There's, you know, folks, especially my generation and others who know themselves because of the relationship through Aspira and their participation through Aspira, right? Once an aspirante, always an aspirante. We say that to one another. And so she's part of that history, right? She comes back to Chicago. She applies for grants. She hires other women, right? You know, people like Maria Cela, who I also write about, Silvia Herrera Fox, you know, who becomes a community member. I don't write about her, but she's someone that I want to be in conversation with subsequent projects that I'm working on. And so they start working together to create these little pockets of hope across the community by the building through the building of Aspira, right? And so she becomes very influential. While I also talk in the book about her husband becoming a little controversial within the community because of how he tries to impose some of his ideas on the community himself, right? But then Maria Estela becomes the first, not just the first Latina, but the first Puerto Rican named to the Chicago Board of Education as part of the response to the Division Street uprising, right? And so she uses her term because she does leave the board pretty early because she realized that she can do more for the community. She's leading these other organizations, right? But she uses her term on the Chicago Board of Education to make sure that the Latino community is being heard, right? Whether it's Puerto Ricans, whether it's Mexican, she works alongside, the other, board member of color, an African-American board member, to make sure that the Black community is being listened to within Chicago, right? And so they're using these positions to institutionalize change, right? But then we also have someone like Carmen Valentin, who I talk about in the book, and becomes another, figure that is controversial between, within the community, who as a teacher and a counselor at Tully and Clemente High School is engaging in acts of resistance herself, right? And so she's taking part in student walkouts. She's in conversation with students to kind of, have these deep conversations about how not just the city, but how U.S. colonialism is influencing the many shortcomings that the students are seeing within school basis, right? So we have these three women who are coming from very different backgrounds, right? They're all college educated women, right? They all had, that background, but who were using their positionality and their relationship to the city in different ways in order to enact educational change, right? To me, Carmen Valentin is one of the most misunderstood figures within the book, right? And I hope that when people, read and engage with her history, understand that she's reacting in a way that she experienced the city herself, right? She's probably one of the younger ones at that point from the three women represented. She's, not just looking at how the schooling in the city is affecting Puerto Ricans, but having this larger conversation around, the political movement, as an independista, right? Having that conversation within that space. And so to me, these three women signify something important within the storytelling, right? Within the history of Puerto Ricans in Chicago, because, it's a reminder that people react from their positionality. How are they experiencing not just schooling, but how are they experiencing their relationship to the city in a way that it's manifesting itself in classrooms in different spaces, right? And so they enact power and change in very, very interesting ways, right? And I really hope that as folks are reading the book, they read the history of Puerto Rican education through the lives of these women.
I was really fascinated by Carmen's work and saw that she showed up at different kinds of struggles, whether it be in the community around the community control issue, or whether it's in the university. And I want to read more about her and her what seems to be a very fascinating history of activism there that most of us don't know about. Now, I find interesting that in the discussion of the role that women played in both community activism and in educational struggles, that throughout the entire work, you point out how the community was not a monolithic community and how there were differences of opinion on issues and strategies and tactics. So how did tensions within Puerto Rican activist organizations impact the struggles for social justice and for educational equality, or even for higher education access? I mean, what impact do the tensions or the differences of opinion have on these struggles?
I think that it actually starts really early, right? And so the 1940s and 1950s, as social agencies are trying to figure out how to deal with what they call the Puerto Rican problem, right? This is the language that they're using. They're viewing the community as a problem. Is that really early on, we start seeing divergent, views coming out of that space, right? And part of it, so I've been reflecting on that a lot recently, because I think that sometimes those divergent views get misunderstood in different ways, right? And so, I think that those early groups in the 1940s and 50s and early 60s, right? I'm talking about groups like Los Caballeros de San Juan, the Human Relations Committee, in Chicago, all of these different groups that are coming together, the Catholic Church, right? That was also very influential in how they were dealing, quote unquote, dealing with the Puerto Rican problem in Chicago, right? I think those early groups that were very, male-centered, right? Very, it was men who were, leading these organizations during that time period, viewed the population as a temporary fixture within the city, right? And so they were looking for temporary fixes, right? And that changes, right? And once that changes, when the community, we're now, by the time, we start seeing the struggles at Tulane Clemente High School, the community's been there for over 2 decades, right? And so they're no longer a temporary fix, right? And so now we see populations or groups that experience the city from very different positions, right? And have different relationships with power within the spaces, now trying to be in conversation with how to deal with schooling issues, right? And we see that, we especially see that around the fight for Tulane Clemente High School, right? Where we, it starts off with a conversation around where they were going to build the school to begin with, right? Whether they were going to build it inside the actual physical Homo Park, right? And destroy parkland and kind of take away that space from the community, which for those who are familiar with the Puerto Rican community in Chicago, the park is very significant because it's a space of celebration for the community too, right? That was going to be taken away, right? To then the naming of the school, right? And so we see these conversations around what's going to happen to the community being made by people with different views about what the community was going to represent, right? And part of that, one of the things I've been thinking about, it was generational, right? It was also classed, and it was racialized in very different ways, right? You have a population of folks who have been in the city now for at least a generation or at least a decade within that space, who were leading some of these organizations, right? Some of them consider themselves or probably occupied middle class status within those spaces, right? And so they had traditionally or historically, right, viewed their agency, what they viewed as their agency, as working alongside city leaders, right? And being part of these organizations that are making decisions, right? And so that they wanted to be inside, or they thought that change was going to come if they worked within these systems, right? But then they're coming and meeting up against a generation of young people in the late 1960s and early 70s, groups like the Young Lords, right? Or the students at Northeastern, or the students at Clemente and Tulane High School. They're coming up against a young population who their whole experience from the city or with the city has been around police violence, right? Has been around disenfranchisement within schools, has been centered around health discrepancies within that space, right? That's been almost kind of centered around lost and marginalization, right? They have a completely different relationship with the city than maybe their parents, or maybe that generation that's leading Los Caballeros de San Juan, or leading the Spanish Action Committee, SAC, right? Which I talk about in the book, or leading El Puertorriqueño, the community, Puerto Rican community newspaper, right? And so, although I do think that their vision, right, their end result, what they want to see for the community, I think is the same. I think they all want to see equitable educational opportunities and resources for their students. I think that that's all the same. But because they experience the city really differently, right, and that they've been racialized very differently, that they've been classed very differently, their gender identity also influences some of these conversations. The way that they enact change, or they're seeking to enact change, is really, really different. So they want the same thing, right? Or at least I like to think that they want the same thing, but their approach is going to be influenced by the way that they lived life in the city, right? Because the older generation was viewed as fellow Americans, right? They were welcome within the city, right? They were approached through that lens, right? Even though it was a lens of assimilation, Americanization, right? That's what the city wanted from them. And now this younger population was sitting in classroom spaces that they felt the most vulnerable in, right? Because they were being ignored, right? That they were being viewed as the problem within those spaces, right? And that they were dropping out or being pushed out in high numbers, right? By the 1970s, you know, Puerto Ricans in Chicago have a 70% dropout rate, right? And this is, you know, this is being framed as a linguistic problem, right? If they learned English a little better, things will be better for them in school spaces. If they decided to become joiners, right, and that's the language that they're using, and participate fully themselves, right, then they wouldn't have such high dropout or push out rates within the city. And so their ideologies and their approaches were really, really different. But at the end of the day, I really do think that these divergent groups, even if they were being influenced by their own relationship or views about the political ideologies framing the island, especially because we see that happening in Chicago, at the end of the day, I think they wanted the same thing. They wanted, you know, Puerto Rican children to have a sense of belonging and have a sense of justice when they walked into Chicago public schools.
So do you think that at some point in time, ideological differences played a key role in maybe halting the advance of the struggles? Do you see the differences of opinion as a positive role or as playing a negative role in community struggles?
I think that differs the older I get too. And when I reflect on that, right, a younger me would have been like, no, you know, listen to the young people about what they can do and how they can engage. And, you know, coloniality is always, you know, at the center of these conversations. And I still believe that. But I also think that there is a way in which their interactions and also interacting with some of these people as their elders in the community too, and kind of seeing how much respect they have for each other has been really interesting. I think that they almost kept each other in check, right? And so that what they reminded us is that listening has to be part of these quest for transformative change within our community, right? You have to listen to what other members of your community is asking for and demanding, because they're also experiencing coloniality in their daily lives in different ways and disenfranchisement in different ways, right? We have to listen to one another. But there were moments where I think that it was used against them, right? And so, you know, the Young Lords and other, you know, groups in Chicago become targeted by federal and local law enforcement agencies that wanted to disrupt the community, right? And so, COINTELPRO comes to Chicago, right? So they're not just targeting, you know, the Black Panthers and American Indian movement, but they're targeting, you know, Chicano and Puerto Rican activists across the United States and their organizations. And so because there were moments where there was a lot of fighting across the community about how to engage in these acts of transformation, that it allowed outsiders and it allowed white supremacy, right? And you know, it really allowed the infiltration of these organizations because there was mistrust already within the community, right? They didn't trust one another because they didn't think that they were that either side was right, and so it allowed for these, you know, infiltrations. When I talk about the Rican, the journal, right, and interviewing some of the folks that were involved in the founding of the journal and its continuation, I asked about the last issue, right, because I needed an end date to say, oh, I need to be able to tell, you know, like when I'm writing, when does the journal end? And one of the individuals that was a founder of the journal said, well, you know, that's funny because no one's ever seen the last issue. And I was like, here, I thought I had all of them. I had been collecting them for years and I thought I had the last issue. And he said, no, the government or Chicago police, Red Squad, someone came in in the printing office and took it. And it was used as evidence about what was happening. They were going to use it as evidence about what was going on, you know, in the community, especially around the independence movement and some of these social, you know, movements that were happening in the 1970s in Chicago. And so even a journal, right, an academic journal, that was started by, you know, young people, that was as a way to create a space for intellectual engagement, but that was also accessible to the community, was targeted as a problem, right? And that needed to be controlled, right? So even the intellectual growth of the community needed to be controlled. And I sat with that for a long time because I thought about what that meant. So here I am writing about, you know, the activism that's happening within the community and how control happens within K-12 spaces, right, and higher ed too. But the idea that even the intellectual growth and contributions of our community was not allowed to expand, right? Because it was seen as a problem. It was seen as something that needed to not just be controlled, but be erased, right? And so, this final issue of the journal is sitting in some, federal office or in an archive somewhere. No one seems to know where that journal is. But I think, to me, it reminded folks that all of the fighting that was happening on with the community, and this through some of your work, right, that this happens in community-led organizations, that there's always going to be a divergent, views that kind of influence and sometimes break apart organizations. It also allowed for outsiders to come in and take advantage of that and to create issues within the community itself. And I talk about that in one of the chapters in the book about how discouraging it was for community members to be kind of pinned against one another and kind of being placed in these positions where they were distracted with fighting against one another, that then the change that they wanted to do within the community wasn't going to happen.
Yes, just as a personal note, when I was at Santa Barbara, there was a split within the student movement, and you had two different types of organizations, but they were fighting for the same goal, for the establishment of Chicano studies, for the hiring of faculty. And there was double pressure then on the administration to support both groups. And they got additional funding as a result of that split, because the administration didn't want to play one of the other, knowing that they were both fighting for the same thing. So in this particular case, the differences of opinion and the factionalism and the splits led to very positive results on that particular campus. Maybe going a little bit backwards and coming back to the idea of the community's vision of education and the vision of schooling. You note in one chapter that it was very different from the vision proposed by city leaders and by school leaders. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on what was the community's vision of education and of schooling, and how that differed from the city leaders and political leaders.
Yeah, and that's an interesting, kind of thread across the book, right? About how there's a constant shift in not just who's making these decisions, but what those decisions are going to be made regarding the population, right? Where, the only thing that kind of like spanned across the decades was this idea of that language was going to fix everything, right? That learning English was going to take care of it, right? But here again, when we talk about what these visions of education or for education or even citizenship within that space was going to look like, we see the question or conversation of coloniality present in terms of Puerto Ricans, right? And so then self-determination, whether it's in regards to the island's political future, whether it had to do with who was teaching their children or what curriculum was going to be present within those spaces, right? We see that center stage. And again, the city and school officials centered language as a cause of most of the limitations of the Puerto Rican population, and not the inherent racial discourse that informed the cities and the schools' approaches to what was being perceived as a Puerto Rican problem. And it shifted the blame, right? And I see, I was able to see that in official records from these organizations, who were leading the conversations on education, right? Where the blame was constantly being shifted, right? From the community to the families, sometimes to the city itself, right? And language was always part of that conversation, right? But language couldn't be the root of all the problems. Like I mentioned earlier, like we're seeing a 70% dropout rate or push out rate of Puerto Rican students, who majority of them at that point were probably second generation students, right? And so, Isidro Lucas's piece on the Puerto Rican dropout, even details how the dropout rates for Puerto Ricans was higher among second generation students, right? So students who had their entire schooling relationship or experience be within city schools were the ones that are actually leaving schools, right? In higher numbers. And again, it goes back to that conversation about how they were the ones that were experiencing or had a longer experience with these, not just the racialization that they experienced within schools, but the failures of city school within those spaces, right? And the city wasn't paying attention to those reports around schooling of island children, right? Or city children in any way. And so we even see how when they were creating some of the educational programs in the 1970s to kind of respond to the issues that both Tule and Clemente High School and subsequently Clemente High School, that they weren't even using the documents and the reports that were created by organizations like Aspira, right? That were being funded by an organization like Aspira. And I remember Isidro telling me in his oral history that what they said was, well, the research came from Puerto Ricans themselves, so it's biased, right? So these college students weren't capable of creating data to be used, right? And so what that told me was that the city wasn't able or willing to listen to what the community was saying for themselves, right? And so that they were no part of any type of conversation about what they were going to perceive as a response to what they needed, right? And so, I'll say it again, I actually think that the vision from the community itself was the same, right? And that it kind of carried over, having access to resources, right? But the vision or what the city wanted was not, right? And so the city could no longer physically contain the community, right? And they couldn't physically contain them in classrooms either, right? And so now, the city very early on was educating, and this happens in the Southwest, right? They were educating students, and it happens, with Black community too. They were educating students to meet a certain labor market within the city, right? And Chicago was not, exempt from that, right? Education to meet the very reason why they were, bringing in these migrants to the city to begin with. But the population of Puerto Ricans in the community did not view education in the same way, right? And so education was, again, a site of liberation for them. So maybe they couldn't have a conversation about liberation for their island, but can education at least be the space in which they had a sense of agency, self-determination around their community's needs and what the community was going to look like in subsequent generations. And, even though I end in 1977, we see that happening in the 1980s and 1990s around local school control, right? And the Puerto Rican community was very instrumental and very much center stage in having conversations about what local school control looks like within the community. And so I think all of these conversations, even though there was a difference in opinions and ideologies about how to frame education, right? The vision of education for the community. What I appreciate is that many of us have inherited, right, what came after those struggles, right? There is at least a little more openness around school control in the city because of those early visions of Puerto Rican educators, community leaders, and local youth, right, activists who were talking about what role education was going to play in their children or the community's lives in the 1960s and 70s.
Yes, I just noticed that it's 5:42, so maybe one or two more questions. One of those questions would be, again, maybe you can elaborate on the role of the press for documenting community struggles and for giving voice to the community. I think this chapter is really well written, and it expresses the desires of the community for providing their own interpretations of what's going on and challenging political and city leaders. So maybe talk a little bit about the role of the press.
That always becomes everyone's favorite chapter. When I started writing my dissertation, that was the one that, my own mentors kind of wanted me to kind of focus on in terms of creating this narrative of the community under their own terms. I think that's actually where it comes down to, is that it gave the space for the community to finally have a voice in how they were seeing their experiences and seeing their relationship to the city, right? And, and I start that chapter with a scene between Sturge Turkle and the members of the Young Lords who are facing off with police and local government, right? Who are not allowing them to lead a community-wide event to support their daycare center. And something, and it's actually something you all can listen to, the audio is, I cited in the book, but it's readily available to folks, and the images are archived at the Chicago History Center, which I found after the book came out, actually, which, I was like, oh, this could have been part of that story. But the idea that the community was attempting to celebrate, right, that the Young Lords were attempting to celebrate children, right? That's what they were organizing, right? That's what Turkle came across, right? They were trying to celebrate children, and the opening of a child care center at a church now had rifles pointed at them, right? And yet mainstream media continued to ignore them, right? Or saw them as the problem. It stood with me, right? Because what if a well-respected journalist had not come across this event, right? How would that story be told or have ended, right? When Turco came across the scene, literally the police were out there with rifles, right? And there's a scene where, I think the minister that was part of that church where the daycare center was at would ask, how do you think this would have ended? And he pretty much said, they were pointing rifles at these young people, right? That's what the city's response was, right? To view them not just as criminals, right? But something that had to physically be contained and stopped within that space, right? And that stuck with me. And to me, the community-led press gave them the opportunity to tell stories under their own terms. It gave them the space to celebrate, who they were while also documenting their stories, right? Because we see that in these pages, and at the most basic of levels that allowed them the resources not found in other places, like employment opportunities or housing, right? El Puerto Riqueño was very instrumental in also creating a relationship between the archipelago, between the island and the city, right? So that, folks in the community, if they wanted to follow their hometown's baseball team in Puerto Rico, right, they could open up the pages of a Puerto Riqueño and they would see that in there because they knew that they couldn't get that information in other spaces. Or if the community wanted to honor their young people graduating from high school, moving on to higher education, the newspaper created a space where those children, those young people were going to be celebrated. Or if they wanted to create a space to link them and to support other communities within the city, specifically the Mexican-American Chicano community within the city, the newspaper did that as well. And so I think about what would have been lost to the community had they not created their own spaces, right, to articulate their needs, to celebrate who they were as a community, but to also challenge the city to remind them that they had a responsibility to Puerto Ricans, right? And they also utilized, the newspapers, both the Young Lords and El Puerto Riqueño, as a way to remind the city, we vote, right? We're city residents, we have citizenship, and our endorsement goes a long way within these spaces. And so they use that space to remind the city of their responsibility to the community, because the city was always trying to remind them of their responsibility to the city, right? And so that as if the community owed them something for pretty much existing within that space. And so to me, the press not only anchors the community in a really interesting way and doesn't only offer us these wonderful, beautiful archives to read these stories, but it reminds us of the ways in which every single day they were enacting acts of resistance, right, from what was happening around them. And so, these documents, I don't think I could have told the story of Puerto Rican Chicago if it wasn't for having the space and the resources to listen to the community through the writings that they were doing in the 1960s and 70s. And I'm really appreciative that not all of them, but most of these documents have survived.
Yeah, that's great. Now, maybe at this point we could stop and see if there are any questions. I have several more, but I would like to give the opportunity to people that are listening in.
Yeah, it's Heather here. Thank you both so much. This has been a really fascinating conversation. We've got a couple of questions coming in here. So the first is from Nathan Tanner, and they say, so glad to be present tonight. To Dr. Velázquez's recent point about connecting the past to the future, we are living through a political moment when citizenship rights are, for many, under attack. How can your story about Puerto Rican Chicago in the mid-20th century help us think about ways politically marginalized and racialized communities can disrupt and or resist oppressive education and political policies in the present?
Thank you, Nathan, for this reminder that, especially for historians, that our work has a responsibility to larger communities and larger conversations, right? One of the things, and reading that question that I kind of think about and reflect on is how little has actually changed, and it actually makes me sad, right? And so thinking about the rise in student-led activism, both in K-12 spaces, but then also in higher education, reminds me that these wins are very temporal, right? They exist in a particular moment in history, but that then it almost becomes common that these institutions keep repeating the same types of violence against our communities, right, in different ways. And so I think about how documenting these histories and engaging in these conversations can almost serve as a map for, you know, contemporary conversations about not just the failures that have been implemented or the failures to meet the needs of our communities, right? But celebrate the wins and almost create a roadmap on how do we continue these conversations, right? Because they don't end. And we're seeing that in higher numbers, right? You know, we have young people engaging on school walkouts, you know, in high numbers still, you know, today, right? We still have people engaging in conversations around citizenship, right? That are very limiting and very dehumanizing to our communities. And so I think about how these histories, right? And the histories of folks like that are being written by folks like, you know, Professor San Miguel, right? Can also serve as a roadmap and almost aid in our conversations today.
All right, so next we have a question from Chris. And they say, I personally believe you did a wonderful job painting an empowering and powerful role of Latinx and Puerto Rican students and community members. One area I would have loved to hear more about is your implementation of the Young Lords. Do you plan on talking more about how these organizations originated from struggles out of the community? And how might we try to build a new narrative around these organizations, especially to combat narratives that other people, hierarchical majorities, place on Chicago?
You know, so the Young Lords, it's almost funny because the Young Lords sometimes we're like, oh, people are still writing about the Young Lords, or here's another book on the Young Lords. But then I also sit back and think, actually, I don't think we're done telling the stories of the Young Lords, right, and the work, right, and especially not in Chicago, right. And so I actually think that New York gets covered a lot more, right, and those conversations get covered a lot more. But I think that there's so much more work that needs to be done about the type of influences and you know, the consequences and the legacy of these organizations in contemporary times, right? And so the programs that they've initiated, the gender politics within those spaces, right? What I'm trying to do with my work now is to look at what happens when, you know, these young people that have been both educated under these conditions, but then also organized under these conditions, what happens when they leave the city to attend higher ed institutions in different spaces, right? And so I write about, you know, University of Illinois Circle campus, which is now UIC, and I write about Northeastern, but not all of the students who were at Tule, Clemente, or, you know, looking at the South Side, looking at Kelly High School, all of these other places, not all of them went to Northeastern, UIC, or any of the other universities in the city, right? Some of them went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Some of them went to the University of Iowa. Some of them went to Wayne State, right? And so these students were crossing, you know, borders, right? But we're still understanding their relationship to education under the lenses that they were educated in cities like Chicago, right? And now they become student activists in these spaces because the same things that they were fighting and the communities were fighting in Chicago are now being recreated within these spaces because they're dealing with the same kind of conversations, right? They're racialized in particular ways, they're under-resourced in a lot of different ways. And so I do think that there's more work that has to be done around organizations like the Young Lords, but I'm also thinking of the ways that we have a responsibility to document how these histories map out if we really want to understand the influence and the you know, the consequences of the organizing work that groups like the Young Lords and some of the other groups in Chicago did, right? And so what does it look like when we start mapping out these histories, because, you know, they carry these stories with them as they now enter higher education spaces in other places. So that's kind of where I'm heading, right? I want this history to influence or to at least impact the way that I'm looking at their mobilization and their fight to create home spaces when they leave the city. because I think it matters because most of them come back actually. You know, we never talk about we never map out these life histories in particular ways, but you know, they come back to fight for their community, right? Northeastern's a good example of that. You know, the people that were fighting, the students that were fighting at Northeastern Illinois University to create spaces for Puerto Rican students then become the political leaders within the communities themselves, right? And so I think almost mapping out life stories and life histories is really important.
Okay, so we've got a couple of different questions coming in, all on a similar theme. So I'm going to try to combine all of them here. So this is from Francisca, Isela, and an anonymous attendee. And so I'm going to start with Isela's question to kind of frame it. So how can we use our history to create advocacy and help our children from minorities as they continue to struggle in educational settings? And then Francisca is asking if you have any specific advice for teachers in the public school system. And then an anonymous question is wondering about how you think this book can translate to educators in the academy in higher education.
You know, one of the things that that is coming out of this book is kind of documenting the histories of these teachers that come to Chicago in the 1970s and 1980s, starting again with Miss Navarro, right? The person that kind of like began this book in many different ways. And part of what I'm focusing on is that we're having conversations of, you know, colleges of education are having, you know, and school districts too are having conversations around, you know, almost feeding into the teaching force by encouraging communities of color to go into the teaching force, right? So build your own teaching force coming out of these communities, because Black and brown educators tend to go back to their communities as teachers, right? We go back home to work in the schools that we came out of, right? But we were already doing that. So it's almost, they're attempting to teach us something that we've known all along, right? That our community needs to be engaging with conversations with one another about what education should look like for us, right? You know, we saw with Brown versus Board of Education, right? That it led to a decrease in Black educators because white communities did not want their white children being taught by Black teachers, right? In Chicago in the 1970s, there was a need, and actually programs started to bring in teachers from Puerto Rico to teach in our schools because nobody wanted to teach our kids, right? Nobody wanted to go into these communities, right? So we already know that. And so, you know, my response to colleges of education is look at our histories. We did this already. What happened is that both, you know, coloniality and colonialism and settler colonialism, but then also white supremacy disrupted that, right? So what would our communities have looked like if we were allowed to have a say in the education of our children from the beginning, right? And if that wasn't disrupted. So when people are talking about build your own teacher programs and encouraging, you know, Black and brown young people to go into the teaching profession to help and to work within our communities, read these histories, because we were already doing that, but something disrupted that, right? So it has to become a larger conversation about how do we undo, right, the harms of the past, right? And it's not about creating a pathway, right? But what does it look like to engage in conversations about why we need to do this and how do we learn from the communities themselves?
All right, so it looks like we've got time for one more question. And this one is from Norma. And they ask, what were your experiences navigating the archives? What archives did you discover that did not make it into the book?
So they're primarily good experiences going to the archives, right? But the archives are always a reminder of how we're policed, not just our histories, but our bodies are policed in particular spaces, right? And so that it was also a reminder that for our communities, we only exist in the footnotes of other people's histories, right? And so, you know, it wasn't like I could go to an archive and say, give me everything you have on Puerto Ricans, right? It took building relationships with archivists who understood you know, the importance of building or writing these histories, who would remember in what pockets, right, literal pockets sometimes, in folders, Puerto Ricans existed, right? And so we're constantly, you know, for those of us who are writing our communities' histories or engaging in these conversations, it's a constant reminder, and I'm borrowing from, you know, Tug's work, Celia Hartman's work, right? What does it mean to engage in these kinds of projects, right? And what does it mean to walk into spaces that we depend on to write our community's histories, whose very existence is to erase our histories, right? And so navigating those archives were always an emotional space, right? But then they're also emotional when you find your own history within those spaces, and you start recognizing names, and you start recognizing spaces that inform who you are, right, and your relationship to schools. And so the archives are always a difficult space, right? They're always a space of grieving too for our communities, but then they're also a reminder that if we don't document our histories and we don't start writing and engaging in these conversations, then we're going to cease to exist within those spaces, right? Because again, we live in the footnotes of other people's histories. And so, right, like engaging with the press in Chicago, the Puerto Rican press in Chicago, and being in conversation with those documents were probably why they become not just mine, but other people's favorite chapter in conversation, is because that's where we see the community's voice the most, right? Is when they're writing their own histories and engaging in these conversations, because archives don't do that for us, right? Because we're constantly having to depend on other people's memories to piece together our community's histories.
All right, so it looks like we're just at 6 o'clock here. Thank you both so much. This has been such a wonderful event. A reminder to everyone that if you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, you can use promo code MV22 and you'll get a 40% discount on our website. And this event was recorded, and I should have it up on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So you can definitely watch it again and listen. Before we go, do you have any final thoughts for us?
I want to say thank you, not just to the press, but Professor San Miguel for creating the space for many of us to be reminded of why this work is not only important, but also possible. So I just want to make sure that I say thank you and hope that, that this becomes part of that genealogy that I know that you and other individuals have been very intentional creating for all of us, right? But then also a reminder, especially for students and young folks, who are part of this space right now, is a reminder that our histories and our stories matter, even if we're taught or told that they don't.
I just want to say thank you for inviting me again. I think this was a great conversation, and again, congratulations on such an insightful book that I'm sure people will enjoy and learn a great deal about.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.